A global leader in business intelligence and content marketing solutions to clients across 13 countries. Genevieve Hilton has worked in corporate affairs and sustainability in Asia Pacific since 1994, primarily in Vietnam and Hong Kong. She's been the head of external communications at Asia Pacific for BASF, the world's leading chemical company. And this morning, I understand, may be one of the world's first people to get the certification that the IABC has run the exams for. Is that correct?
I got my certificate training.
So congratulations. Ashwani Singla is the founding managing partner of Astrum, India's first science-based reputation advisory firm. He's also a trusted advisor and a strategist to C-suite and political leaders. And Professor Jim McNamara, who is a professor of public communication at the University of Technology in Sydney, has a distinguished 30-year career that spans journalism, public relations, and media research. So we have an esteemed panel with quite a diverse range of experience, and I hope we can take advantage of that today. Richard, would you like to start, please?
Thank you, yes, and good afternoon, everybody. I think our brief, as I understand it, is to kind of just wrap up a couple of the things that we feel would take out from the session the last couple of days, and also some of the key challenges of communicating across this particular region. So I've got three. I might not take all of my 5 minutes, but I've got three. The first, I think, first, and it's a personal battle for me as well, is that I think I think to sum it up, Asia is not one market, and I think we can very easily, by lumping together a number of different countries under a banner of Asia, we can forget that actually there are a number of different markets within Asia, and it's important that we communicate accordingly. And I think it's important that we kind of continue to remember that particularly within the context of strategies. I think that leads into my second point, which hopefully will dovetail into my third. And the second is complexity, and ever increasing complexity around communications, both from a device and a channel perspective. And I think this particular region in the world is probably more complex than any other. Not least through as I mentioned, multiple markets, but also language complexities, but also the number of different channels which are unique to different parts and different countries within the region itself. So I think that's a significant challenge. And the final point that I think has come out of a number of different conversations over the last couple of days, and I think is a kind of underlying subtext to a number of different avenues of conversation, is the non-linearity of communications, particularly within this region, and the fact that it's very hard to have any kind of homogenous mass market broadcast-related conversation with a big audience. And I think that, again, that links through to the complexity and the nature of the way that the market is different in this particular part of the world. So those three things. Asia is not one market, huge levels of complexity with regards to channel and device, and the non-linearity of the need to communicate through different channels. So there would be my three.
I was trying to figure out a structure to talk about. It's we've been worrying about all these calm people who don't know how to crunch numbers and don't know how to run Excel sheets. So I thought my structure, I'll take the positive and the negative. So the negative is that we are still talking about the same damn problems that we were talking about 20 years ago. I heard this fellow called Jim McNamara make a speech in 2001 about measurement. I thought it was really cool. It really inspired me. But he was talking about the same problems in 2001 that we're talking about now. And the ways that, the models have gotten complex and sophisticated and wonderful, but there's still a lot of the same things going on. And that makes me think that these are not going to change. The difficulty in measuring impact as opposed to just output, this is probably not going to change in Asia or anywhere else. This is going to continue to be difficult. It's my prediction. Test me again in 15 years. At the same time, we've also been talking about certification and trying to find out, what's the way to enhance ourselves as a profession, be taken seriously, and get a seat at the table. This challenge doesn't seem to have, it's progressed somewhat, but in this region or elsewhere, I don't think we'll still be talking about that in another 10, 15 years. And complexity, I think, goes without saying. As Asia becomes more important, the complexity of our profession and of the markets we're working in is going to become clearer, and we will see that the complexity is fractal. You zoom in and it's still just that complex. You look at a particular country, let's say China, hugely complex. You go to one province, it's just as complex as it was, it's even more so. Zoom in on a city, it's just as complex. So this is a little bit my negative. Now if you go to the positive, is that because of the growing importance of this region simply from a business, from a market perspective, we are going to see more and more Asia becoming the source of new ideas and best practices. I mean, just some things that I was hearing today. So it was almost a casual comment in one of the sessions about using the tactic of employees acting in dramas as an employee communications tactic. I thought it was brilliant. I never thought about that before. And I can still get new ideas after after being a jaded cynic. And I can still find this news. This is fantastic. So I think we're going to see not only this, but this level of sophistication, especially obviously coming out of Australia, for example, and India, is blowing my mind all the time. And the things that I'm not knowing about, for example, because I don't speak Korean, they're doing fantastic things there, but I just can't read. I'm not reading about it. They're not submitting awards they're not submitting award entries, but you know what's happening there too. So this is where we're going to find the source. Asia is the source of ideas, the source of best practices, not as the recipient of best practices from other places. So this is what I'm looking forward to the most, and my positive prediction.
Thank you. I was not trying to repeat the points that have already been made. As trusted advisors to CEOs, whether from the consulting side or from in-house, I always wonder, so what keeps my boss awake at night, and how do I try to align some of my work with those concerns and challenges that's keeping the CEO awake? And so I went around to figure out, and I spoke to almost about 100 CCOs and CEOs and CMOs across the country and across this region to really try to understand what was the key challenges that they were looking at, and therefore how could public relations, corporate communications play a supportive role. So here's what I learned. One, the 3 R's that's keeping them up, and the good news, reputation is number 1 on the agenda. So therefore, our job is central to the success of the C-suite, and in particular, CEO reputation is very high on the CEO's agenda. If you look at Travis Kalanick, you look at cases around the world, Volkswagen, the CEO reputation becomes the alter ego of the company and almost has a great influence on the success or failure of the company. So reputation is taking a center stage both as a corporate reputation agenda, also as the CEO's individual reputation. So I think that's very critical. Second, in a growingly complex VUCA world, risk and risk management is a very important aspect of CEO's agenda. When you look at regulatory risks, small America First policy changes the world for people who are building businesses. You look at the Indian IT industry and has gone through a transformative change in the last 6 months with just very simple thing as a simple rule of an H-1B1 visa change in US. So regulatory risks today are cross-boundary, and therefore negotiating regulatory risks and helping companies sort of steer that is a very important responsibility that the C-suite is looking at corporate communications, corporate affairs professionals, and they are becoming more and more volatile. When you look at the third dimension of what I call returns, the third R, it's both marketplace returns and investment returns. Well, in the world of PE money, hedge funds, shortened investor cycles, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the C-suite to deliver quarter-on-quarter results. Now, you did see in Dr. Rajan's presentation a bunch of companies that have committed to long-term sort of value creation and they avoid quarterly guidances. But nevertheless, the lesson I've learned is that number 2 is not good enough, because unless you're really the leader in number 1, there's absolutely no hope of you to survive. So being number 1 is becoming a very, very important aspect. And therefore, how do communicators help a company stand apart, differentiate itself from the rest of the pack, is a very important agenda on the C-suite. Therefore, where do I see communication and how communication needs to become smarter and more agile? What I'm seeing right now in my conversations with the agency world across the comms domain, there is now a beginning of the automation AI platforms, NLP platforms beginning to take shape. Whether it's in monitoring right now, I think there's a lot more usage in monitoring that you're starting to use, and Jim talked about that earlier in his research. I'm beginning to see that automation is going to play a significant role in the next 3 to 5 years as more and more automated jobs in the front line become automated. I think that's going to be an important part. Well, Facebook yesterday gave us an example of how Facebook Workplace in 360-degree is creating the experience. So whether it's VR or AR or automation, I think new technologies are going to play a very central role in the way things are going to be used. So are we skilled enough? Are we going to be agile enough to adapt ourselves to the use of these technologies that are going to become mainstream very soon? So I think that's one thing that really sort of keeps me awake as a communicator, that am I going to be relevant in the new scheme of things? And the demographic dividend of the millennials is clearly going to be an advantage nation. The second thing that really gets my attention, when I started my career in public relations, convergence was the buzzword. Well, the cinema convergence, but when I look at it here, 25 years almost down the line, I believe today we live in a converged world. Why? Because today we have platform convergence. You can move seamlessly from phone to app to notebook to a television. There's no differentiation experience. But a very important aspect of conversion is the consumption. Earned, owned, paid media, you cannot differentiate. So there's a conversion on the platform, there's a conversion on the mediums, and you can care how and where you're consuming content. You're seeing a video on your handphone, or you're reading something on an app. So the true convergence of consumption is going to challenge us both in formats of communication and the manner of communication. How do you ensure that you are going to be able to play a role in this converged environment where technology plays a significant role? So adaptability, change, and what I almost in a software language saying, are we going to be able to upgrade our operating system fast enough to stay relevant and stay pertinent in the scheme of things to come? So that's my sort of overall sense of where the industry is heading and what we need to do. Thank you.
I've got 4 points. Some of them will be brief because they would repeat what others have said, but I think it's no distinction in Asia Pacific versus elsewhere that data and data analysis are really key issues on our plate. I think it's something though I get a sense of terror in many of people's eyes when we talk about data. And I think the thing to think there is practically is you may, as an arts and humanities person, you may not be the person to do it. But think about either partnering with an agency or think about being smart in your hiring. Because I know a lot of organizations now, when they get a vacancy, instead of hiring another ex-journo or a PR person, are hiring a data analyst or hiring a behavioral insights person. So think about how you can bring that skill into your team. Just one other quick point on data, and Richard talked a lot about it. It's critical, and automation and algorithms are part of our life. But think also carefully and critically about data. We need to clean data. We need data hygiene. It hasn't been mentioned here, but there is a lot of junk data out there. Every one of you in this room will have bought a product recently. You would have hired a dinner suit, as I did in London, or bought a car. Now, your data is collected as you go across the web, and that data is sold at a premium price to advertisers, but I'm not going to be buying a dinner suit in London the next 6 months or a year. And I've already bought a car. How many of you have done that? And your ads are being sold. So there's a lot of data there that's not being correlated. People have already bought the product, and we're still selling ads saying they're a hot prospect. It won't surprise you to know that I'll say two-way communication. In fact, that's a tautology. There is no such thing. Communication is by nature meant to be two-way. It's communis. One way is information transmission. So we have got to learn to be doing listening as well as telling. A lot of mentions in the conference about strategic and being strategic. And I think there's a big issue here. This is a worldwide issue, and it's important in Asia. But I think we've got to break down silos. IABC to me is ahead of the game in this a little bit because we talk about communication. You've got the word business in your name, but a lot of you are government, so that's a bit of a misnomer. that the public relations industry is a silo, for example. And there's an old saying, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you're a PR agency, you want to do PR. You don't do strategy, you already made up your mind to do PR. If you're an ad agency, you've got to make ads. You can't be strategic in a silo. And so if we really want to get the seat at the boardroom table, we want to be strategic, we've actually got to get out of our silos. Finally, something that hasn't been mentioned at this conference, I don't think much at all. In an era of big data, in an era that we can track consumers and understand people and gain audience insights, we've also got to think about ethics and governance, because our audiences are also more empowered than ever before. And if we push the boundary too far, if we exploit them, if we invade their privacy, they will bite back, and they have more powers and more tools available than ever before to do that. And so there's a very sensitive balancing there. I think we can be strategic, but we also have to have a social conscience and think of ethics and governance in everything we do, particularly in the handling of data.
Thank you. So you've talked a lot, each of you, about complexity, about the need for accurate, clean, relevant data, and for doing the things that matter to the chief executives. And I think many of us in the room, would like to be able to be operating in that way, at least most of the time. My own experience has been, though, that we often get caught into fixing the problem of the day. Someone made a comment to me during the crisis scenario, this is a regular day for me. And that's what it is. There's, the time periods have become so much more condensed. Have you got any advice for us on how to manage that increasing pressure to do something and do it now, when really we need to have an eye on the future and the longer term game at the same time?
Maybe I take a crack at this with an analogy, which someone mentioned earlier was a good one. We can be firefighters, and that's okay, because when the house is on fire, that's what you want. You want a firefighter, and you want an experienced one, someone who's fought 100 fires. You don't want a professor of firefighting theory who has read all the books about firefighting. You want someone who's been there and done that a lot. And we try to professionalize our function, but we mustn't forget that it is, at the moment, I believe, and will continue to be, a craft, a well-honed craft, professional craft, not an academic subject when it's in practice. I mean, of course, if you're studying it, it's an academic subject, but when you're doing it, it's a craft. It's not necessarily a science. And to ensure that we are doing the things for the CEOs that they need, sometimes we have to fight the fires, we fight them well, and then when the fire is over, then we do the things like, educating when the firemen came to your school when you were little and told you how to do fire safety. That's what we also have to do, and that's things like risk and reputation management. So this, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be a firefighter.
I'd really like to invite people who've got questions to come to the microphones, perhaps. Maybe if I can ask one in the meantime, how well do you think we're preparing our next generation of communicators for this environment, which requires influencing skills and negotiation, an ability to work with data experts if they're not those particular analytical people themselves?
Let me take a crack at that. In the last couple of years, I've had the privilege to work across a line of education, from both K-12 education, which is kindergarten to secondary, and then a lot of work around professional education with higher education, these schools, and sometimes even craft professions. The question that you're asking is applicable to just about every field of education, because the rate of change at which the skill sets required for the next generation of workers is there, the education system isn't cared. When you think about McKinsey's latest study on the future of jobs, 69% of all jobs will be redundant by 2020, and that's 3 years from now. So the pace of change at which this transformation is taking place with technology, I don't know whether it will happen by 2020 or not, but certainly it's something to do with how we need to get. So when you look at the new framework, skills framework, we talk about collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, and there are 5 or 6 key skills that we are talking about. What's the good news? The good news is the millennials inherently are with these skills: creative thinking, collaboration, micro-entrepreneurship, and they're not as competitive, but they're more collaborative. So I think there is a change required in the education system that needs to happen very quickly to get up for the skills of the future. At the same time, if we adapt quicker, then we can establish the chain of thinking. Otherwise, if we are in the Stone Age as we start to think about the skill shift, I don't think the kids are going to be ready.
As an educator, I feel I have to make a comment on that one. Look, I think we were, and I'm part of this generation, I have to say, but I think we were badly served by a lot of ex-journalists coming into public relations in these fields in the early days, because I was one of them. I was a great writer. I could produce content, and I thought that's what the job was, and I had no clue about audiences. We learned that along the way, and I think a great talk given just recently, given just before this session by Glenda Hewitt, talked about the importance of ongoing learning. And we look across this field of practice, we've still got lower population of master's degrees in most other occupations. You go into the senior boardrooms, management teams, everyone's got postgrad. McKinsey tells me that we've now got more industry PhDs than academic PhDs, and that's the case in my university. So that's where the bar is going. People are going to high level qualifications and studying new things like creative intelligence and innovation, behavioural insights, psychology, and so forth. So I believe the universities are playing their role, technical education, organisations like IABC, but individuals need to be committed to ongoing learning, and we need to catch up. The young ones coming through are getting it, and it's our job to make sure they do. But having a BA these days, or just saying, oh, I'm a writer, is probably not going to cut it in the future, because there's about 9 million ex-journalists out there looking for a job. So we need to upgrade our skills.
Can I make a comment on that? My first PR boss didn't teach me how to use a fax machine because he didn't know how. I had to learn it by myself. And I didn't teach the junior staff today how to use Facebook. They had to learn that by themselves. But I also never expected my boss to teach me how to use a fax machine. And by the way, I swore after feeding the press release into the fax machine 10 times for 10 journalists that I would never use one again once I could avoid it. But the expectation from me was not that my boss would teach me. What I expected from the management, my management at that time, that they would give me the capacity and the freedom to continue that self-learning. And these are the things that I think make a good professional in the future, is someone who has shown that initiative and capacity to do that self-learning, not necessarily the one who has got the degree, or who has been provided with the degree, even the PhD in whatever organizational communications. I don't know that that's valuable to me.
I'll say what we're saying different. You don't get given degrees, you have to earn them. They are things that they are exactly what you're saying. They are people taking the initiative, and it hasn't got to be a PhD.
Professional education, I support that as well. So I'm just talking about the commitment to ongoing learning and addressing some of those challenges. And yes, don't knock university degrees. I do probably more research and more practice than anyone in this room. I won 3 in global awards for campaigns last year, and all of my staff have industry experience. So there is this theory-practice gap. Don't be fooled by that. Most senior academics these days do a lot of practice, and isn't it funny that the European Commission and the UK government hire me to advise them on their communication, and they're not hiring PR professionals, and so forth. So I think we're going to work together. We're in the same team. We've got to work together.
I might ask one more question. Ben, I'm wondering, can we make these roving mics, maybe to encourage people, don't have to feel that they're walking up to the stage, because I would like to get some questions from the group. But I think this is an interesting theme here, which is about, it is actually about collaboration. It's a little bit about mentoring. It's about how do we help our colleagues, the people that we know in our organisations, ask those right questions. And I think while the tactics and the avenues to solve things might be changing and changing quickly, I think what experienced people can do is help to define what is the actual issue that we need to address here. And is there a communication solution, or is there a business change or a cultural issue that needs to be addressed? So that sort of speaks to the complexity. And that's all kind of well and good, but a lot of the people you talk to are so stuck behind their desks these days. It seems to be more difficult, and I'd be interested in any views from the floor of whether in your careers you feel it's more difficult to get out of the office than you used to. Obviously, we're all here, so we can see the value in that. But you know, a lot of people I talk to say, I don't even get out for a lunch break, and I'm lucky to catch up with my friends on the weekend. I'm just not out having the kind of conversations that we used to take for granted.
That's a long way, a long stretch. I think there's a couple of things that I think link all three of those questions together. For me, there's an adaptability piece, because I think we have to keep moving. I think more importantly, to your last point, is intent. Is that without express intent from all of us, we won't enact those changes. These things don't happen by accident. And I think that links back to the original question for me around strategy, which also comes to time frame, is that we were traditionally trained to build 12-month strategies that coincided with budget cycles, etc., etc. We need to be thinking about 12 weeks, not 12 months. And again, it needs to be intent-based. The strategy doesn't happen by accident, and it certainly doesn't happen by accident on a rolling 3-month basis. But again, back to Jim's point earlier about hiring outside of traditional skill sets and hiring outside of kind of communication skill sets, hiring the right people into a team that can actually monitor and change and shift those strategies and patterns on a 12-week cycle are much more likely to put you ahead of the game rather than waiting for this 12-month thing to just roll around, because we were trained that way 20 years ago.
There's 2 or 3 points I'd like to make to Ginny's point. 22 years in this profession, the debate is still the same, right? Measurement, tactics, strategic thinking, C-suite acceptance. We haven't shifted the dialogue. It says something about adaptability, and it says something about our own ability to shift the perception of the people within our own organizations. So why are we sort of going around in circles? I've attended every conference possible around the world, measurement, digital. These are all standard discussions that have been happening for my first global conference was ECO in 2006. We talked about next practices. It's 2017. We are still talking about the next practices. So there's the same. So I think there's something about us that we need to examine as to why we aren't able to shift our own needle of perception when we are supposed to be change makers and perception creators for the whole world. So adaptability is a significant question when it comes to. Second, I don't necessarily believe that overnight, because we are starting to rely on automation and data, that will grow some kind of extra intelligence and will be multidisciplinary animals in the next 3. We will shift the dialogue in the last 15. Right? So what's going to happen, and that's really where I'm experimenting these things in my firm, because I'm using my firm as a test bed to test some new concepts. You're going to start to see the emergence of multidisciplinary skill sets collaborating together. So not necessarily the writer has to become a data expert and has to be an AI expert and a digital expert. You're going to start to create multidisciplinary skills to collaborate and create solutions where you can bring the best of what you have out. What you will need, I think, is an appreciation of each other's roles and capabilities to be able to complement that as a unit. So I think you're going to start to see teamwork becoming very critical, because I can tell you it took me almost a decade when I started doing market research to learn about market research and the intricacies of market research, right? So it's not easy, and I was 40 when I started sort of having the second window of my life to say, look, I'm going to get into science. So that's my view on how we're going to sort of be able to shift. But I think the first most important thing that Richard said is, look, when the hell that we are going to change the dialogue within our own industry.
May I add just one thing to that? The question therefore is, are we good enough as in HR, or as managers, not as I work for a German company, and we always talk about communications people, or Eiergelände Vollmilchsau, which is an animal that it lays eggs, it gives milk, it gives meat, it can cut its wool, and it does everything. So we don't want to be a bunch of those. We want to be the guy who who not only hires a data analyst in the team, but also knows how to manage and how to get the most out of the data analyst, and hires the market research guy and knows how to get the most out of it.
Absolutely.
The question was primarily on how do we develop the future communicators, and the discussion has been extremely good, telling us of the challenges. But ultimately, what we as members of IABC must develop an action plan, what we as individuals and as a community need to do. So otherwise the discussion will be purely theoretical and purely academic in that sense of understanding challenges and not doing anything about it. So one of the things that the APAC board actually launched 3-4 months back was a mentorship program, which we sent out a letter to all the chapter leaders. My concept there was that each of us, being professionals in the communication profession, must offer ourselves as mentors to the next generation who will join IABC or who are already within IABC. There must be mentorship relationships within chapters, mentorship relationships across chapters, across countries, and across the region. So for that, what I had proposed was, and the letter is already with the chapter leaders, that each of us kind of pick up at least one mentee within the region. We offer ourselves as mentors to them. We put our picture, small biodata, and the specialization that we possess and our contact numbers and emails onto the APAC website. We showcase, APAC will showcase its expertise on that website. How many specializations, how many experienced communicators are there in the APAC region? Let that be available on the website. Let the junior IABC members as well as potential IABC members, students, write to these mentors to seek guidance on any topic that they wish to. So you have a pool of mentors put on the APAC website, and you allow people to interact with each other, develop connections, and that's one of the strategic goals of IABC, is to create connections.
Yeah.
So I would suggest that we take a push on that mentorship front a little more seriously.
And I can see a question here, and I think it's increasing the visibility of our expertise as well in that way, so that people can find us if they're looking for some expert assistance is important too.
Thank you. I have a question, and it's maybe a little bit of a can of worms, but it seems like we've tripped into an interesting period. It's post-truth, it's fake news. The internet was supposed to be holding people to account, but it seems like we've suddenly turned a bit of a different corner. I wonder if each of you might just be able to say a few words about, maybe what the truth means to you, or just a little bit of commentary on this new fake news, post-truth era that we're in.
I do have a very strong view on this. I come from a family, my father was a civil servant, and we've grown up in very influential position. And I've grown up watching my father have visitors over festivals come with gifts and go back, taking those gifts back. And they were served a cup of tea, and we lived a very modest life, often challenging. I think the lines are in our minds and in our hearts. Truth is not proportional, it's absolute. Therefore, it's about the choices that we have to make as conscience keepers of the company or the clients we serve. I think Terry's tweet that Sharon put up yesterday in the evening said it right. Pardon my use of the language, that guy had the balls to put it on Twitter and said, if you are a CCO, tell your boss to resign. I would do that. I would resign myself. So I think the lines that we have to draw have to be dark and deep, and then there is no compromise. If you make that choice, 22 years in this profession in India, I do corporate affairs, I do public affairs, I've done traditional public relations, I'm yet to pay a penny or give a gift to get my job done. Right? So I may not live in a farmhouse, I may live in a modest house, but that's the choice I made. So my actions have to define, so the choice is individual. I don't see a conflict in that.
There's a lot of talk about fake news and as if it's some new era. I'm not convinced there's anything new about that. Politicians have lied since time immemorial, since Julius Caesar, and don't forget yellow journalism. You know, the early 20th century. And I go back to my point that I think things come into perspective as you accumulate knowledge. And the point I made before, rather forcefully, but let's not have separation of academic and practical work, because academic work, most of the work I do is applied. It's actually being implemented in organisations. And I think we've got to work together. Mentoring is important because we learn from the best in the field. But what the academic work does is also do that research into what could be. How could we do it differently? Let's rethink the industry. And we also study history. And history is, funnily enough, a great teacher. And so yellow journalism and fake news and tabloid journalism, I just think it's more exposed today. It's out there more, and maybe actually that's a good thing, because look how we know what Donald Trump is about. And in the past, we didn't know what John Kennedy was about. Maybe a great president, but we find out later all sorts of things went on. We just didn't know about it. And so I just think, bringing it into perspective, taking a longer term historical view, and accumulating a body of knowledge is very important.
Sorry, yes.
Your point.
Yes.
Okay. So this goes to the last question around fake news and something you said, Jim, before around silos and silo thinking. And for me, the two are very interconnected, fake news, silo thinking. So my question to you and anyone else on the panel who wants to address it is, how do we start to cut through those silos? What do we do with our messaging to start to break down those silos?
I'll try and be brief so the others, because I've had to say. I think there's a structural side and a practice side. Structurally, I think here in Asia, look broadly around the world, because the most obvious silos are things like the advertising industry, the public relations industry. The public relations industry is largely a North American phenomenon. Most of our theory and practice comes from North America. If you go to Europe, the term public relations is hardly used, and it's not just rebranding. They think differently. If you go to the UK, the head of communication is responsible for all advertising, all media relations, all websites, and truly can think strategically. So I'd encourage you to look outside of Asia, look outside of North America, challenge that, look at European models, look at some other models, look at what's happening in China, because there's things they do better than us and there's things they do worse than us. So I think that's a structural thing. I come out of some of those industries, but I can't see how we can continue to have a PR industry and an advertising industry. You can't even tell the bloody difference between the two things half the time. Peso model is turned upside down. Paid earned, shared owned is now shared owned, native advertising and so forth. And I think as professionals, I think getting out of those silos, I don't regard myself as doing PR or advertising. I think I do strategic communication. So others may have a view.
No, I completely agree with that. I talked about briefly consumption when I talked the convergence, so you have platform convergence, consumption. So I sort of call it consumption convergence because it's all seamless. Therefore, there's no concept of PR is, in fact, let me take you back. I'm a big follower of Edward Bernays. I read a lot on Walter Lippmann and Ed Bernays. These are the founding fathers of our profession. And they didn't see any silos. Ed Bernays used advertising, research, editorial, all forms of techniques to influence, or what he said, crystallize public opinion. And he wrote in his first book, which was in 1914, he said the role of a communicator is to decode public opinion to this organization and encode the message of the organization to the public. If that's the simple definition of persuasion, then I don't see any boundaries. That's at the theoretical or at a conceptual level. But I think the skill set requirements that you have as automation takes place, as media becomes seamless, there is no other option but to collaborate and create multidisciplinary skills to win. Otherwise, there's only one path, which is loss. I think it's thrust upon us, so whether you like it or not, you've got to change.
Edward Bernays was a nephew of Sigmund Freud.
Yes, he was Sigmund Freud. So if you really look at it, the origin of our profession actually lies in behavioral sciences.
Yeah.
So if you combine behavioral sciences and behavioral economics with communication, that's very truly when you talk about persuasion and influence or choice.
Cool. I appreciate the combined experience of you fine folks. So I thought I would change the pace a little bit and just ask about as we see sweeping across the globe a bit of a political axis shift from left and right to more globalist and nationalist. What sort of trends and themes have you seen changing in the Asia Pacific? And also, what sort of roles and responsibilities, not only just roles, but responsibilities, do we have as communicators within our own corporations and our corporate culture to either resist or adapt or completely repel these sort of things happening?
Maybe I'll comment a little bit on that from someone who's inside a large multinational corporation. We heard this morning about listening, and it's basically listening is even more important in this situation than ever. And as you just mentioned a minute ago, for example, our Asia Pacific office, a lot of times I feel that our main job is interpreting what the hell's going on in Korea, Japan, Vietnam, whatever, and explaining it to our head office in Germany. And vice versa, right? When Germany is doing something crazy, I have to explain to the guy in Pakistan why why they would come up with this. This listening and interpreting within the organization is taking up more and more importance. And if we translate that to a political level, then I think that's maybe something beyond the scope of the corporate communicator, but certainly within a multinational organization, it's listening and interpreting between offices and headquarters and outposts in the outback.
And the interesting part for me about that is it's about what's the mood out there? How are people feeling and responding and reacting, and what do they want and what are they not getting that they want? And
so-called understanding your target audiences.
Yeah, so I'm interested in, do you feel that even though we've got more channels to listen and engage, even though we've got more data, even though we've got hundreds of years of experience in marketing and all of these sorts of things, do you feel like we know more or less about the audiences and the publics that we're supposed to serve?
I think we could know more, but we're not asking the questions. And I think that comes to the last question as well, is that our ability as a profession to resist the acceptance of populism is where we should look to kind of influence both inside and outside organisations. And I think it's interesting to go back to the question about fake news and ironic in many respects that it was Donald Trump who effectively made fake news an accepted piece of terminology that we are now quite happy to agree with. And when he first started talking about it within the context of it being CNN who were espousing fake news, we all laughed at him. Now we go, yeah, fake news is a real problem. And we need to resist the acceptance of that and continue to make sure that as a profession we are questioning these popular opinions.
Having sort of worked in politics for a while now, I think the questions of boundaries start to come up front and central, links to the state of economic improvement in a country. When the going's good, I don't think anybody talked about nationalism. It was all about globalization, expansion. And as the jobs started to contract and the economic well-being started to reduce, we had migration, refugees, nation first, America first, India first, kind of issues that France, Marine Le Pen, fundamentally driven by politics of creating the hype of seeking the votes that I'm going to be the great protector. Trump, great example. So it's part of it is, I think, socioeconomic. Brexit is a great example. Professor talked about the fact that people of a certain demographic felt that they were marginalized, they had no say, and their future was getting impacted by the large influx of immigration. So going back to his measurement model of communication, I think that the thin line that you saw on the top about the social and the economic context to the society, it plays a very, very large and influential role in public communication. And therefore, when you talk about diversity, it could be gender, ethnic, racial. As communicators, we swear to some principles of togetherness, unity, and those are the principles that I believe we continue to espouse consistently. Learning from what Dr. Rajan said last evening, that today if organizations find a larger purpose and then subscribe and link their actions to the purpose, then you will find that the acceptance of the larger corporate communication to be greater. And that's been my experience. And I think companies that do that successfully, like the Tata Group, with Leadership with Trust or Quality of Life or Unilevers, will see gains both financially and in social and other equity.
I think we've just got time for one more question. Colin?
I think it's interesting we're talking about fake news right now, and I wanted to examine the technology that's driving fake news. So, whether it's with Trump's campaign or with Brexit's campaign, there was this shadowy organization that's called Cambridge Analytica that was reportedly driving it. So what they did was apparently to analyze data, big data, and understand each constituent's fears, and basically push out ads targeted at these fears. So it's interesting that Jim talked about breaking down the silos and whether is it PR or advertising whatsoever. It's all about understanding your audience and getting your message out to them. So how do you think our communication industry, whether it's PR, advertising, how you're utilizing new technologies, whether it's AI or AR, VR, as one of the workshops talked about yesterday, in leveraging these technologies to communicate to our audience? Are we doing that enough? And how can we, as an industry, encourage the adoption of such technology? Because in AI talent is limited all around the world. Every company is trying to look for AI talent, and it's at a premium. So should we think about developing that expertise internally? Sending our people for development in such areas?
What you left out of what I said is I also finished with a strong point on ethics and governance. And I think that is a key part of the equation. Cambridge Analytica used some very clever skills, but they won't be hired by a major political party probably again, because there's been a huge amount of backlash from that, because they use that data to target vulnerable people, and they also use real psychological techniques to target people in ways that you have to question whether it was ethical. They made promises that were impossible to be upheld. And so the academic in me is very critical of that, and I've looked very closely at the work of Cambridge Analytica, and I've talked to the people who employed them, and they said they will not be employing them again, and there's a lot of concern about that. As an industry, and going back to Richard's talk, I think there is so much potential in the data to use it, but surely we should also want to use it for good. We should use it for the benefit of our organisation, but the whole nature of relationships and of engagement is mutual benefit. Our stakeholders and our publics and our societies have also got to prosper. And if we take the approach of, to be perfectly blunt, the campaign of Donald Trump was all about winning office at any cost. If our corporations and our governments act like that, we will suffer the fate that Donald Trump will almost invariably suffer within the next year or two. And I think we have to think long term. So it is always that responsibility of balancing ethics and good behaviour and governance with exploiting technologies. If we were the medical profession sitting in this room, think of the marvels of medical science and technology, but we would be having huge discussions with ethicists about which do we do and when do we do certain procedures. We have to act in that very professional way, and I think that's something that's a bit lacking in the marketing profession, to be honest. It's all about how can we exploit this data and not too much thinking about where are the boundaries and where should we self-regulate. So I think that's a great challenge for us to act as ethical communicators as well as effective communicators.
Okay, then I go back to the very beginning of our session, which was storytelling. So back in 2008, I saw a Twitter account started called ExxonMobil Corp. Remember that one? And they put out, it was a Twitter account saying issued all the press releases of ExxonMobil, talked about their CSR projects and so forth, and it turned out to be fake. It wasn't them. It wasn't the PR department or the corp comm department of ExxonMobil. That scared the daylights out of me. And the next thing I did when I heard about it was I started BASF's first Twitter account because I didn't want to be the guy who was taken over by some fake version of BASF and who was putting out some news, who knows, saying fake anything about chemistry or about the chemical industry. I wanted to be able to have that voice in the market in the place where people were paying attention. And this was 10 years ago when it was just on its way up. And this is our responsibility in order to maintain the ethical principles of the company, in order to be the voice of reason in a kind of a crazy market. Then we have got to be on top of things. Where are things going to have our own voice properly established and our own ears properly open to listen to what's going on. Otherwise, the fake news will take over and we won't be anywhere.
So I think, in summary, what we've been talking about is we have the means, we have the data, we have the networks, we have the tools to use, and we should be using them for good and in an ethical way to the benefit of all of our publics and our customers. And that is a heavy role and responsibility for all of us. But having met many of you, I'm confident that we've got the right teams on the ground. Thank you so much to Richard, to Genevieve, to Ashwani and Jim for being so generous with your time.